Con ustedes, Andrew Hollister, Vice President de LogRhythm LABS.
Hello everyone, my name is Andrew Hollister and I'm really excited to be presenting at IT Solutions Day. I run the Labs team here at LogRhythm, focusing on threat, compliance and operational risk research, as well as holding the Deputy CISO role. We have a huge investment in Mexico and realize that the threats and challenges we face are the same wherever we are located in the world. Cybercrime knows no national boundaries. LogRhythm was founded with the vision of saving the world from cyber threats, and that security first message continues to be at the core of what we do today. At the conference now, I'm presenting the results of our recent worldwide survey of cybersecurity professionals, and I hope you find the findings both interesting and informative as you build out your own security programs and seek to get buy-in from your board and other stakeholders. Cybersecurity leaders are under pressure from many different sides, and I hope the conference as a whole helps you in the challenging role that you undertake. I'm going to stop the camera now and carry on with the presentation. I hope you enjoy it.
Collaboration between those individuals and departments responsible for the success of any business has never been more important than it is now. Almost every business operates on a cyber-driven foundation, and the security of that foundation is therefore critical to the success of the business, just as financial and other controls are essential to its success. Cybersecurity has perhaps been seen as a bit of a dark art and a purely technical discipline that is veiled with often confusing or impenetrable terminology and should remain under IT. We wanted to explore the relationship between security, or perhaps more precisely security leaders, and the C-suite. And I'm pleased to present the results of this research, which was conducted on our behalf by Ponemon and has provided us with some interesting perspectives, plus a few surprises. Over the next 30 minutes or so, I'd like to walk you through the results of our recent survey, explore the state of the influence of security leaders, security budgets and their spending priorities, and I'll also air some of the factors and challenges affecting the security leader's role, as well as offering some tips on how to make sure that security priorities are not only aligned with, but also become an integral part of the business priorities within an organization. So the Ponemon Institute surveyed around 1,400 cybersecurity professionals globally and really looking to learn valuable information about both the role and the responsibilities of today's cybersecurity leaders. So let's have a look at some of the results. Our survey found that 60% of organizations had experienced a cyber attack during the course of the past 2 years. In more than 1/3 of these cases, no one was actually held responsible for the cyber attack at the organization. And where anyone was held responsible, it was most commonly both the CEO and the IT security leader jointly, in spite of the fact that almost half of IT security leaders believe that they should in fact be held responsible. And this probably talks to the fact that the IT security leader doesn't have as much visibility and perceived responsibility as they should have, and indeed that they do shoulder based on the fact that they believe they should be held responsible. We also looked at organizations that had experienced an actual data breach, i.e. that cyber attack had turned into a loss of data, and 55% said they had experienced a data breach over the past 2 years. The numbers on the slide here are very close to the cyber attack numbers, but they lean a little more towards an expectation that the CEO takes responsibility. And this speaks to how loss of business data is perceived to be a business problem versus a cyber attack being perceived as an IT problem. It may also be an indicator that a lack of budget control leads to the expectation that the CEO has accepted the risk and thereby should carry the responsibility. We wanted to find out how influential the role of the cybersecurity leader really is in practice. And again, given the fact that most organizations rely on a cyber foundation, you would think that the cybersecurity leader would be both visible and influential. As it turns out, only 7% of security leaders report directly to the CEO. And this is a big problem for visibility and for getting cybersecurity on the agenda. And why is this a problem exactly? Well, maybe the children's game of Chinese whispers is part of the answer. If you aren't communicating directly with the CEO, you don't know if the message that you are trying to convey is in fact the message that arrives. This is a question of being able to communicate clearly and also in terms that the other business leaders can understand, as well as having the background information to back up your request or proposal. Another business leader from one of these disciplines listed here, who is presenting your proposal, may not be able to articulate the wider cybersecurity implications of what is being proposed. On average, cybersecurity leaders are actually 3 organizational levels away from the CEO. So if there's a disconnect between executive leadership and the cybersecurity leader, how is the role in fact perceived? And we saw a difference between what the senior leadership believes about security being able to support business goals versus what confidence that executive leadership has that security leadership understands the business goals. And I think, again, some of this comes back to the fact that cybersecurity is seen as a technical discipline. And maybe much of the communication outwards is also of a technical nature. If you think about some of the reporting of cyber attacks, it can soon become very technical and not really oriented toward a business audience at all. Some CISOs are pursuing business qualifications such as an MBA, and this can help to add additional understanding of why senior management makes certain decisions and how the security aspect fits into that wider picture. It can also give the CISO visibility into how the business operates and equip them to speak the language of the executive team and board. Perhaps not too surprisingly either, given the survey respondents, nearly 2/3 of them believe that the cybersecurity leader should report to the CEO. They recognise that security can't be pushed up through the organisation. It needs top-down adoption. Looking beyond the executive leadership and to the board, then, we found a worrying picture here too. Almost half only report to the board of directors when a security incident has occurred. And that's akin to shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. At this point, the organisation really is in firefighting mode, and the questions the board are asking at this point are far away from maturing the security posture of the organisation in a structured way. It may well be a question of actually saving the company if, for example, a ransomware attack is in progress. Furthermore, around 30% only report once or twice a year to the board. And if that's the case, it's probably a very quick overview, almost certainly focused on budget rather than on any meaningful level of discussion of risk and threat. And as previously mentioned, the fact that the person with direct responsibility for cybersecurity is most likely not doing the actual presenting, that will further limit the ability for the board to see the wider implications. Topics at board meetings are another interesting subject, and they may well be chosen by the board. And clearly, empirical measurements are far and away the most requested information, and perhaps indicating an interest in a return on investment or at least justification on spend. And further to that, compliance obviously will always be top of mind, particularly in regulated industries and where perhaps GDPR and other privacy mandates that are accompanied by significant financial penalties are involved. It is surprising, though, that more boards are not interested in changes to the threat landscape as they affect the business, as well as changes to the organisation's security and risk posture. And there could be an opportunity here for boards to be better educated on what they should focus on when it concerns cybersecurity. The influence of the security leader covers a wide range of things, and budget responsibility can be an indicator of that influence. Average security budgets among our respondents was around the $38 million mark, and most leaders have at least some influence over that budget. This does underline a bit the point around cybersecurity leaders reporting to the CEO. It's difficult to understand why they so commonly don't have a direct reporting line when such a significant level of funding is involved. Effective budgeting does require the cybersecurity leader to have insight into the organisation's broader budgetary priorities. And in this way, they can determine what proportion of overall spending is to be allocated to security and ensuring it's a realistic mix. And it's also important to consider the actual value of the assets being protected versus the spending. There's no point in spending $5 to protect something worth $1. As indicated on this slide, whilst the board are not asking as many questions as they should about threat and risk, security leaders themselves are being influenced by these factors when requesting increased security budgets. Data breaches, cyber attacks, and recent security incidents are significant drivers for increased security budgets, and this is perhaps somewhat inevitable. But as the saying goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and if the board was also more educated and therefore focused on those things that present risk to the organisation, the spending could perhaps be more structured, and rather than firefighting after the event, a proactive security programme built over time based on evaluated risk would provide a much better return on investment and also provide those more meaningful measurements of actual effectiveness and efficiency that the board were looking for. Digital transformation is also a significant driver for increases in the security budget, and we'll talk more around this shortly. But the enforced digital transformation brought on by the pandemic certainly focused minds, and where concessions to security had to be made in order to keep the business running, additional risk was taken on by those concessions. And ultimately, security leaders know that needs to be addressed, endpoint security being one of the highlighted risks. Automation is both the kind of promise and Achilles heel really in security, but I believe generally too much focus has been placed on automating response and not enough on automating the repeatable steps of investigation. And it continues to be an area of spending priority for security leaders, along with AI and machine learning approaches. What was a little surprising here was to see the preference for investing in in-house expertise over consultants and MSSP, and maybe this remains an area where deep internal knowledge of the organisation, its culture and inner workings that you gain in-house is still the differing factor. Ultimately, an external consultant likely will need that in-house expertise to provide context to the expertise that they bring to the table. So, moving on from the influence and reach of the cybersecurity leaders, what are the biggest factors and challenges in the role? So, let's start with looking at how the security leaders perceive the top cybersecurity risks affecting organisations. And we expected phishing and ransomware to rank very highly here, and the responses indicated that was indeed the case. And I have to assume that the participants in the survey took cloud vulnerabilities to include configuration errors and overly permissive configurations, since all the evidence points to misconfiguration of cloud services being a much more likely vector for breach than a direct vulnerability. Nearly half of our respondents saw negligent insider threats as one of their top risks, whilst less than a fifth cited malicious insider risks. And this really tallies with other surveys that indicate that operator or user error is a significant contributor to insider threats overall. Given the timing of this survey and the wide prevalence of remote workforces being driven by the pandemic response, endpoint security was also cited as a risk by almost 2/3 of respondents. And rightly or wrongly, organisations have historically taken some comfort from the fact that endpoints are primarily located within their organisational perimeter, and thus the network itself, whether that's wired or wireless, services such as DNS and other key services are provided by the employer, and thereby to some extent they're controlled. Within the perimeter of the organisation's buildings also, there's likely to be more monitoring, and perhaps as a result of that, employees are likely to follow policy more closely. On that basis, they believe they are being monitored. Additionally, there's perhaps a physical reminder based on location, which is absent at their kitchen table, home office, or in the local coffee shop. With working from home also being a long-term feature, it's more likely that family members may use those work devices, thus introducing further risk. In addition to being one of the biggest security risks, the remote workforce is also the biggest security challenge. And part of the reason for this may be the rapidity with which remote working was adopted. Some concessions to security had to be made in order to keep the business running. And ultimately, those concessions have to be addressed. And this may well be one of the factors driving the rapid adoption of zero trust over the course of the pandemic. Indications are that the interest and adoption of zero trust approaches has really skyrocketed during 2020 to 2021. And the recognition that the idea of a hard perimeter with a soft centre that had run its course was already becoming commonplace prior to the pandemic. But post-pandemic, with both the workforce and many assets now outside of any sort of organisational perimeter, zero trust has almost become a no-brainer. That doesn't make it any easier to implement, but certainly it's a solid approach for the hybrid environment we find ourselves operating within today. Third-party risks have obviously come more to the fore in the past year too, notably with the SolarWinds breach. But this is not really new either, and addressing those risks throughout the organisation remains an ongoing challenge for a majority of security leaders. Our CISO likes to say what's new is new and what's old is new, and that's certainly the case here. There's perhaps not a lot surprising about the responses we see here. Every option in this question was reasonably highly scored, which is an indicator of some of the pressure there is on security teams today. There's many varied challenges, and limited visibility and resource constraints make cybersecurity a demanding area to operate within for everyone. Looking at the risks and priorities that cybersecurity leaders highlight, they clearly want to do the right thing for the businesses they service, of course. And this is further reflected in the top concern around their job security actually being insufficient budget to invest in the right technologies in order to be able to deliver on that risk reduction. It is telling that more than 50% worry about senior leadership not understanding their role, and this perhaps also contributes to the feeling of a lack of executive support. This does contrast, though, with a relatively low percentage who don't believe that cybersecurity is viewed as a business risk. And this point must have been significantly underlined both to the C-suite as well as the board over the course of the last 12 months. Businesses can and have folded as a result of a cyber attack, so no one should be in any doubt on this point. And I'd expect this response to trend even further downwards with time. Security leaders are assuming more accountability for the security posture of the company. And again, looking at the relatively weak relationship with the C-suite and the board, this is a concerning deviation. As these leaders assume more accountability, they need more visibility and more executive and board level support to ensure that their programs for risk reductions are actually carried and they're not looked at as nice to have or less important than other business priorities. On the contrary, a strong security posture should be viewed as a business enabler from the CEO down. Interestingly, whilst half of respondents had assumed more accountability, less than half said that their compensation had increased in the same time frame. With that increase in risk and responsibility, it's perhaps to be expected that a majority of security leaders do have termination protections written into their contracts. Of those that didn't, half would like such protections to offset the risk associated with their role. I'll just briefly touch on preparation for incidents. You can read the details in the full report on our website, but more than 3/4 of our respondents did have incident response plans in place. However, less than half of incident response plans are reviewed and updated regularly. And this again ties back to cybersecurity risks not being viewed as a business risk as much as it should be. An incident response plan that is never reviewed loses value rapidly as both the business and the technology landscape are in constant change. Less than half of incident response plans had guidance specifically on managing a ransomware incident. And this really is a problem given the prevalence and destructive nature of today's ransomware attacks. And it really is somewhat out of kilter with ransomware being one of the top risks to organizations. Similarly, organizations appear less prepared than one would anticipate for data breaches caused by insiders of any kind. So, a strong security posture really is at risk because IT security leaders are not as influential and valued as they should be. And this is really a coin with two sides. The wider executive team, as well as the board, need to understand the importance of cybersecurity, and it's not just a technical discipline. However, those charged with leading cybersecurity efforts within organizations also need to ensure that they do both understand and communicate in the language of the business, and that they tailor their actions to align with organizational goals. For example, understanding where a cybersecurity budget can come from, what areas it can influence, and so on. And furthermore, they need to understand and be able to articulate the process and the operational efficiencies of security and how that impacts the overall business. Ultimately, if you can't translate security to the business, you will fail as a cybersecurity leader. It is that critical. So let's look at some recommendations to elevate the importance of the IT security leader's role. And firstly, sensitive and confidential data should be considered the currency of the information age. And IT security leaders need to communicate the solutions that are in place to safeguard important data assets such as intellectual property and customer records in a way that does not have a negative impact on business goals and operations. Leaders need to ensure security policies are appropriate and adequate to support business objectives. Appropriate and adequate really being the key points here. Not too much, but proportional to the value of the assets being protected, and also in line with the risk appetite of the business. Leaders really need to demonstrate a grasp of the wider business and budget objectives, and planning and budgeting also needs to take into account your organization's core business activities. Security needs to be seen in the context of all business activity to ensure that it is as relevant and effective as possible. Leaders need to ensure that they have an effective instant response and disaster recovery plan in place, and ensure that the CEO and the board of directors understand the level of preparedness. And as shown in the survey, many briefings are only occurring after a security incident, and plans are not reviewed regularly. And this really needs to change and be a part of a regular cadence of updates. And finally here, be persistent in scheduling meetings with the C-suite and with the board of directors, and don't give up on this. Keep pushing the importance. Prioritize learning about the business and build your security programs with those business outcomes in mind. The transition from a technical cybersecurity role into a cybersecurity leadership role unavoidably brings with it a requirement to both understand and consider the wider business implications. And you really should embrace that for success. And perhaps as a footnote here, in addition to the board, it's increasingly important for cybersecurity leaders to establish connections with people at all levels across the organization. This will enable them to get a clear understanding of what is happening and where potential security challenges may exist. That's what I had for today. I hope you found that interesting and insightful.
Thanks for listening today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Agradecemos a Andrew Hollister por su participación en el IT Solutions Day.